Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just giving it a few seconds while everybody comes in from the waiting room. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. It just shows how important you take the NSGP and all the assistance. So it's appreciate you taking the time out to be here. So just kind of want to give you a little background of how we envision this going. I know a lot of you have been on our national webinars and other meetings where we lay out, generally NSGP, and here's what you need, and here's best practices for completing the application. For this meeting, and we do it every year, we're joined by Warren Shepard and Shanika Turner. They are part of the team at GMA, the state administrative agency that administers the grant for us. So they're responsible for reviewing the grants, assisting with the scoring, working with FEMA, et cetera. So this is a great opportunity for you all for them to provide input, specific input, and for you to be able to ask any questions that you have of them while they're on with us. So Warren, Shanika, thank you very much for being here. We really appreciate your time. I talk to, and I know Debbie does too, my counterparts all over the country. And I'm not just saying this because they're on with us, but we are extremely lucky in Georgia. A lot of SAAs don't interact as much or are not as helpful. So we're very lucky that to have that resource here in Georgia. I also wanted to introduce Debbie Gottlieb. Debbie is our Secure Community Network Director of Grants Management. So she is the national expert on all things NSGP. Anytime Brian and I have a question, we go directly to Debbie. And for those of you that have been on our national webinars, you'll recognize Debbie, who's on with us today as well. So Debbie, thank you for taking the time. So the way we'll let this flow is Debbie's going to start us off going over changes from last year, unique things to the NSGP, and then with Warren and Shanika's input, and then hopefully it'll turn into a conversation, and we can answer all the questions that you all have related to your application for this year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Neil, and thanks for those kind words. I shudder when you say the word expert, because I don't think anyone could be an expert in NSGP, as it is like a ping pong ball, hard to catch. But I would say that I'm more knowledgeable than the average person on the corner. But certainly, if I don't know an answer, I will do my very best to try to find an answer for you. So with that, I just want to echo Neil's sentiments as far as being thankful for Warren and Shanika. I do work across the country, and I do recognize that their time is so valuable, and it is really exceptional for them to have taken the time to be on this kind of call and to have that kind of conversation with them and their input. It is truly invaluable. So from my perspective, I thank you, Warren and Shanika, for taking the time to augment what I have to say and to have this valuable discussion. So with that, I'd like to jump in. I do have some slides. And what I wanted to focus on today is to just talk about some of the changes from last year. And we're going to jump in and take a look at some of those. And of course, just talk general terms in terms of the NSGP itself, how you can best propose to get this started, where you need to be, and what your realistic expectations should be of what this grant's going to look like for you, and whether it is the right grant for you this year, whether you should wait a year, and what it looks like on the tail end of it. Should you be so lucky as to get an award, what you can expect, because the better that you prepare up front, the better it'll be in the long term, because you'll know how to allocate not only your financial resources, but also your staff resources. I know most of you are either volunteers or very minimal staff. And so if you can prepare ahead of time, it really does make it much easier in the implementation. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and jump into the PowerPoint. And Neil, if you could just give me a thumbs up if you see the screen. Great, thank you. So I thought that it would really be important to kind of give you an outline of what last year's timeline looked like, and also understand where we are this year, and that we're expecting that last year's timeline and this year's timeline will not look anything alike. So last year, Congress took a long time to get their appropriations and allocations approved, and things just really got very, very delayed. So we didn't see the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which for those of you that aren't aware is sort of the starting point and the treatise for this nonprofit security grant program. If you were to take a look at last year's NOFO, as I'm going to call it, you will see that it has all the details about the eligibility requirements, what the timeline is as far as the state's obligation, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and then the submission deadlines and so on. So that's really the starting point of this, and when everybody starts to get moving. We all prepare in advance, but that's really when the gun goes off for that horse race. Last year, it didn't start until May 13th. So that was quite late. And if you can look historically, you will see that it's quite late. Congress has already made their allocation for this year. They've allocated about $305 million, up from the $250 last year for this grant. And so they're ahead of their timetable from last year. So we do expect the NOFO hopefully to be released as soon as the end of February, which will mean that everything that you see here on the screen is going to be moving forward. So the reason for this screenshot is to be able to emphasize to you that if you haven't already started preparing and getting everything together for this grant, then that should be a priority for you right now, because you don't be lulled into the sense of, oh, it's coming out in May. It's only January, almost February now. I have plenty of time. We're really going to see this escalate on a much earlier timetable than last year. So if you take one thing away from this meeting today, is that please get your ducks in order. And we're going to talk about how to do that. So here again, I'm showing last year's. What happened last year is the Notice of Funding Opportunity came out in May, and then FEMA gave the states a month to get their applications back to them. And each state gave their own deadlines. So now we're going to fast forward to this year, and you're going to see how this is going to be much earlier this year. So as I said last year, and as I say probably every month, if not every week, when I talk on various webinars and talk to various organizations all over the country, the best thing that you can do in order to put yourself in the best foot forward for this grant is to get ready earlier. And why do I say that? Because that gives you the opportunity to get all of the items that you need to review your investment justification, to make sure you get the strongest assessment that you have, to get everything in order so that when those deadlines come out, it's not a mad rush. And you can make sure that you're presenting the most optimal documents that you can. So I'm going to repeat that again for this year, but just make sure that you realize that the deadlines are going to be much shorter this year than last, and everything's going to come out earlier. So one of the main, I would say, points of last year that's different this year is that over the past couple of years, the federal government has been transitioning from using DUNS numbers. And just to clarify what that is, DUNS number is a Dun and Bradstreet number. So every organization needed to get one to work to get into the federal system. And obviously DUNS numbers had other functionality outside of the federal government, but that was their identifier. So similar to your social security number as an individual, The DUNS number was that identifier in the federal system. It took a number of years, and the federal government was changing slowly, and they wanted to remove using the DUNS number and having their own identifier number. And last year was the cutoff point by which time they no longer recognized the DUNS number, and you needed a unique entity identifier. But what happened is this transition took place in April. And as you saw from the earlier slide, the NOFO came out in May. So the federal system, sam.gov in particular, was inundated with massive requests for this UEI number, and they just could not accommodate. So as an accommodation to those who were applying for the NSGP and were not ready with their UEI number, FEMA said that you didn't need it as of time of application, but you did need it at time of award, when the system hopefully would be able to remove all of the clogs that there were and be able to process. It's still slow. It's still very slow. And I know personally from working with many organizations that are still trying to get their UEI numbers. The difference is that now it's a requirement. So you're not going to have that flexibility to say, well, I don't have it, I'm in the process of getting it. You will need it. And so I put here on the screen some links that you can get. And these links are also on our website on securecommunitynetwork.org on our NSGP page. I have put the quick start guide for getting a UEI, and it's very straightforward. And you will need some documentation from your organization, some legal documentation. It will take time. So if you don't have the UEI number as of yet, then you should really get on that so that you can be timely for the application. The other link here, the other YouTube video, is a very clear and instructional video that the federal government has put out on how to navigate through the sam.gov website in order to get a UEI number. So they're both helpful, and if you follow through, you should be able to come out with a UEI number. Now, some states, and I will turn to Warren or Shanika for that guidance, do also require an active sam.gov registration. So the clarification for that is that you can have a UEI number, but you don't necessarily have to have an active sam.gov registration in order to have that UEI number. However, some states do require that, and I'll stop for a moment if Warren or Shanika would like to chime in and let us know where Georgia stands on that. Warren, Shanika, are you there?
I'm here. I'd have to defer to Shanika on the SAM's requirement. She may have stepped away for a moment, so
no worries. We can get back to that, but that is something that you should check out to make sure if Georgia does require active SAM registration. Again, you can go into SAM and it'll give you step-by-step instructions on how to get that active SAM registration. They're going to ask for point of contact for administrative, point of contact for your financial. They might want some banking information just in case there's wire transfers involved. You should have all that information. And then the SAM registration is free. And so please be wary. There are many organizations that send out emails asking you to pay a fee that they'll set you up in sam.gov. Please, 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 it is not that complicated. I spoke with an organization the other day that spent $500 on their SAM registration. It's not necessary. You can follow the steps. There are many guides, and if you reach a hiccup, you can always reach out to Neil or myself, and I'll try to work you through the issues. There's also an excellent help desk. The number is right there on the screen. And sometimes, depending on when you call, the wait times can be lengthy, But once you do reach a representative, they are also extremely helpful in working you through to get to that point. The SAM registration does expire on an annual basis, but your UEI number is just like your Social Security number. That's your organization's identifier. So that does not expire, only the registration. So if you do register for sam.gov, you should put a little tickler in your file to when your expiration date is next year. It's an annual registration. All you need to do is go in, just make sure that everything is still current, whoever you want as your contact are still employed or volunteers, whatever. And that's all you need. And then you register, and then you get a thing that you're registered for another year. So it's pretty simple, but again, it can be critical when it comes to the NSGP. So some of the issues that came up last year were about the physical address of the facility. So sometimes where I get the question all the time, well, we're under construction and we're planning to be in next December, or, you know, we're building something, or we have plans, and what should we do? And this particular grant is very specific that your organization must be physically located at the site, and that you must be occupying at the time of application. So if you're in construction mode and you're not occupying at the time that you're submitting your application, then you're not eligible. You should wait. So the question comes up, well, that doesn't make any sense because I'm going to be putting in cameras, and while the construction is going on, it would be the best time to do it. And what seems to be the common answer to that is that if you are constructing your site, then you can put in the wiring while the walls are open, which makes sense. And then at the time when you're finally done and you're ready and you're occupying and you're applying, then you can apply for all of the equipment, and not obviously the wiring, but just the equipment. And it will still be more feasibly financially than if you wait and then have to open up the walls and put in the equipment. Or if you have drop ceilings, then it's not a problem. But if this is going behind a wall, that's one way to do it. And of course, as I said earlier, throughout this, if you have any questions, you can feel free to ask me as I'm going through, or you can wait to the end. So last year, we saw some changes, not necessarily applying to your state, but there were some states that were reducing the max cap on the NSGP. So when the max cap was 150, they were only permitting organizations to apply for up to $50,000 a site. And last year, FEMA changed that. And each state cannot reduce their max amount. So you can apply for up to $150,000 per application, and you can submit up to three locations, and they can be anywhere in the state. It cannot exceed $450,000. But again, all of those locations must be occupied. So for example, if you are an educational facility and you have a lower school and a middle school and a high school, you can apply for up to 3 separate locations. So contracted security personnel. This has sort of been a hornet's nest for the NSGP. A few years ago, it was not even permissible to apply for personnel, and FEMA then expanded the eligibility and allowed contracted security personnel. But it is very, very complicated. And I've even put on the screen that many SAAs value this investment differently. And I think Warren last year had some comments on that, and I will let you comment on it this year as well, so everyone on this call can hear about it. But I want to just give some background. This was really, contracted security personnel was really extended to this NSGP in order to support your target hardening. This is really a target hardening grant. So things like the cameras and the bollards, which I'll go into in a bit, that's your target hardening. And the personnel are really there just to augment and to support that. So there are many requirements for this personnel eligibility that must be met in order for you to even make the argument. And I wanted to put those out. And then there are other considerations that you must keep in mind if you decide that you want to request that. So first of all, last year, FEMA made it a requirement that if you are going to request for personnel, you have to submit at the end of your the 3 years or whatever the period of performance is for your state, you must submit a sustainability plan. What does that mean? That means that you have to show that you have a plan by which you're going to be able to sustain these personnel for future years beyond the NSGP funding. That, in fact, is a very difficult requirement for many organizations, and maybe will make them reconsider whether they want to apply for personnel. Also, you cannot use more than 50% of your award towards that personnel, and that requires, if you want to ask for more, it requires a waiver from your SAA and from FEMA. And also, you must request, that request must be mentioned, but not only mentioned in the assessment, but also described as a critical need in the assessment and how it's going to upgrade and improve your target hardening. So be very, very wary of this. It sounds like it's nice, and I know that many organizations really have the need to have security personnel, and this is one way that they feel they can, but you really have to understand all of the different caveats that there are regarding this allowable section. And I'd like Warren to comment on where Georgia stands so that you understand when going in when you make this request. Warren?
Yes, thank you. We will not disqualify your application if you request security. However, when we're reviewing and looking at our rankings and our ratings, all things being equal between two projects, if one of them is requesting security and one is requesting all target hardening items that are there 24/7 and have a 5-year lifespan or longer, that would receive priority and would be granted the funding. Also, based on the dollar amount now, because it's 50% and the grant's gone up to 150,000, there are some requirements on how you acquire the contractor. It's no longer a matter of just going out to local law enforcement and saying, oh, the rate is $35 an hour, or in some cases, I think it's close to 70 now in the metro area. And that's who I'm going to hire. No, you have to do a bid process, and you have to have documentation along those lines. As was said, this is a target hardening grant. We want something that's going to be there all the time, not just that 2-hour window, before services and after services. We want something that's there the whole time, because you never know when one of these people are going to show up and try to do some harm. If they're 15 minutes before security leaves or 15 minutes after they leave, that security didn't help. And people will do pre-event surveillance. They'll come out and look, and they'll say, oh, sure, Saturday, there's always somebody from security here. Nobody's here on Friday. I'm going to come on Friday and do the bad act. Any questions on that? Okay, I'll turn it back over to you, Deborah.
Great. Thanks, Warren. Much appreciated for that clarification. So again, please think very carefully about whether it's worth it to submit for security personnel. And if you do, you really should follow all of the guidelines that we've talked about and make sure they not only is there a bidding process, but on your application, you have to be very specific about who you're planning on hiring, what the bidding process is, when they will be there, how much it's going to cost. And so, again, just beware that this must be followed, because as we No, this is an extremely competitive grant. Last year, the awards were 50% of what the applications, in other words, they had twice the amount of applications versus the number of awards. So, and I expect it to be the same. It just gets more and more competitive every year. So whatever you can do to put your application up front, it would be the best thing for your organization and increase your success rate.
Debbie, can I interrupt for 1 second? We have a question from
Absolutely.
Micah.
Absolutely.
Question is there any analogous requirements for physical improvements that we demonstrate the ability to continually maintain a system put in place? For example, alarms, cameras, mechanical gates, etc. So Micah, is by analogous requirements, you referring to what we were talking about with the security officers? Micah, you there?
I can ask Warren, do you want to respond, or I can respond?
I can tell you that we do come out and conduct post-award inspections or audits, and we will be looking at the equipment. And part of the checklist that we go through talks about, do you have maintenance procedures in place? Do you have a procedure for disposing of the equipment? If you dispose of the equipment within a certain time period, you're required to notify us that you've done that. It's based on the type of the equipment and the expense, and that'll be explained to you when you receive the grant. But yeah, we would anticipate that you should continue, it should be functional. I mean, if you install lighting, we understand the light bulb may be burnt out. We would hope that you replace the light bulb right away. But if you've got a camera system and say your drive goes down and you're no longer, it's not able to record or view, that's something you'd have to replace right away. We'd want that. And we come out and do the inspections. And for those that are new to the process, I've done a few of them this year already at 2 locations. And I will say that those places were very squared away. They had all the documentation. When I walked in, it was a folder with all the grant information and another folder with all their maintenance agreements and how work orders and everything they had done. So went seamlessly, walked around and inspected it, made sure it was there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. Thanks, Warren.
Thanks, Warren. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the investment justification form, which is the application. In years past, it was done on an Excel spreadsheet, and it caused a lot of problems for many people. And last year, they moved to an online form, which was not, it was a bit easier. It had its own problems, but there were certain areas that really made it very clear. So for example, there's one section that asks for the AEL codes, which is the authorized equipment list for the eligible items. And in the past, you would have to put in the code. But last year they had a drop-down menu. So it could have guided you to what was allowable and what was not. So if you didn't see anything there, that you knew that that would not be an eligible line item. We do have another helpful resource on our NSGP page is a layman's guide to the AEL. And that the reason we do that is because the authorized equipment list is from the federal government, and it's a multitude of pages, but only certain sections are applicable to the NSGP. So we've consolidated that into a form and also used layman's language to make it a little bit more accessible to those that are not that familiar with some of this terminology. So if you're curious as to whether something is eligible or not, you can take a look at that guide and it'll help you figure out what something belongs to. So if you want to put in bollards and you're not sure what the AEL code is, that'll help guide you through that. So the online form will most likely be used again this year, but just because it's online and not available yet, don't let that stop you from working on a draft right now. You can get everything done. I don't believe that there will be much change from the formatting of last year. And you can definitely work off the sample of last year, which again, you can find as a resource on our page, and answer the questions. You can be better placed if you do that in advance. This way, if you're not sure how to answer a question, you can either ask us or anyone else that's familiar with the best ways to respond. On our website, there is also a webinar recording that we did last month on how to complete the investment justification form step by step. So you can use that along with the sample to really formulate a very strong application even at this time. And if they do come out with any kind of adjustments in this year when the NOFO comes out, it will be probably minor and you can do those very quickly. But don't wait until the form does come out to start filling it out. The other thing is your entity's legal name. Last year, we came across many issues with congregations or nonprofits that their legal name was slightly different. The legal name meaning the name that you find on your 501c3 or your incorporation papers. And if the name that you are applying for and your legal name or your UEI number don't match, you can run into trouble. So make sure that that is correct. Take a look at your legal documents to make sure that you use the right name and the right address from where you're located. They also ask you this year, which they haven't in the past, if you lease or own. If you're a tenant or if you own the property, you can apply as a tenant, but there are some other qualifications. Mostly, you must have your landlord's permission. And as Warren indicated earlier, there is a requirement to keep the equipment. So if you're in a short-term lease, you need to explain how you're going to fulfill that requirement to keep the equipment. Is it the type of equipment that you can take with you to a new facility? Or are you a long-term tenant and you plan on renewing your lease? So those are things that have to be explained in order to avoid any kind of disqualification. And they are also asking last year if you received prior NSGP funding. So if you were not involved with the application in the past, you should find out that information now from someone who knows what year you received, your organization received the grant, what was the amount, and what were the investments, what were the improvements, the security improvements that you did when you did get the grant. So that these are all things you can prepare in advance before the deadline. So I've just put some of the more popular allowable equipment just to give you a sense of the scope of this grant. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with these, but again, anything that you are asking for must be in your assessment. So if you feel that your organization needs new lighting in the parking lot, then just please make sure that your assessment speaks about the need for the lighting. And same goes for everything else. It should be there, and it should speak to the need and the priority of those. So just make sure that those two are married to one another in the sense that they speak the same language. And one of the tips that I often say when filling out your investment justification, if you are applying for more than one item, try to follow the same order that of the items as your assessment. So for example, if your assessment talks about the CCTV systems first, and then the lighting, and then the fencing, try to follow that in your application and refer to the assessment. So say, as noted in the assessment on page 4, there is poor exterior lighting in the parking lot. It is helpful for reviewers to then follow along rather than having to jump back and forth. And it makes more sense to have that sort of procedure and organization. We want to try to make it as smooth as possible for those that are reviewing it so that you get the most amount of points, and that when you're describing these things, you can get credit for being comprehensive. Lauren, do you have any comments on that, or can I go on?
I agree with your assessment there. It is very important to keep it that logical step by step, windows, windows, doors, doors. Sometimes going back and forth, things can be missed. It prevents that from happening. It also allows us to see that you're covering those vulnerabilities. Should almost be able to, as we start and we see what your vulnerabilities are, I should be able to read that and then know what you're going to be asking for before I even get to that section where you're telling me what you're asking for, because you've identified those. So that's the way that should be written.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to make a note, since we're talking about the difference between last year and this year, last year and the year prior. So in prior years, FEMA started giving bonus points if you're a first-time recipient. And they expanded that last year. They gave bonus points for first-time recipients, as well as those in underserved communities. So the question is always asked, well, I got a grant in 2009. Am I a first-time recipient? It's been such a long time. And the answer is no. If you've gotten a federal NSGP grant at all at any point, you're not considered a first-time recipient. However, if you are a recipient of a state grant, but not a federal grant, then you are a first-time recipient. So there is a differentiation there between the state grants and the federal grants. So as I talked about earlier, this is a very competitive grant. So if you are a first-time recipient, please take advantage of the fact that you have this opportunity to get these extra points because of where you are in the timeline. And if you make a strong application, then you're standing in great footing to have success. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the common errors that we see in applications when we review them. And hopefully if you hear this information, you can circumvent having to make the same errors. So as Warren said earlier, you really need to have a complete application. So I've reviewed applications where people have written not applicable. For example, in the question where it says, describe how your facility can be a facility in the event of an emergency or a terrorist attack, how you can respond. And the answer was not applicable. That's not the proper answer for those questions. You want each and every section of your investment justification filled out, and not only completed, but completed succinctly and comprehensively. The grading sheet that the SAAs and FEMA work off of grade you on how well you answer the question. So again, just to circle back, if you need assistance in the right way or the best way to answer, then you can take a look at our webinar on how to complete the investment justification. The next area that we see some errors in is historical threats versus current threats. So there is a section, the threat section, that talks about, what is the threat to your facility? And hopefully you haven't had a direct threat, but if you have, that would be of utmost importance to describe what threat has happened to your facility. But if you are going to be talking about threats to your either direct facility or those in your region or locally, or drawing an analogy to another facility that has had a threat to it, you want to really start out with current threats versus anything that might have happened to your facility 10, 15 years ago. And of course, you can talk about those because those are important, but you really want to emphasize current threats. And when I mention facilities similar to yours, you want to draw the parallel. So it's not sufficient to just say, we are a synagogue, and a synagogue was attacked 2 years ago in Colleyville, or a year ago, or 3 years ago, there was an attack in Poway. You really want to draw the analogy as to why that attack really is a threat to your institution. Draw the parallel. You're the same size, you're in a suburb, or whatever, however you argue the parallels, it's important to bring that home because you really want to make the argument about why you are considered at risk of a terrorist attack, because when you peel it all away, that's really the value of this grant. Why is your organization at risk of terrorist attack? And again, the inability to express that connection. So when you're talking about what your vulnerabilities are and why you need these as investments, you really need to bring that connection to terrorist attack. Some facilities see a problem with crime or other interests that are putting them at risk. This is not a crime-based grant. This is a terrorist-based grant. So you really want to stay focused on that and keep in tune with what you're asking for, as well as what the investments are, how everything is connected to that. And finally, unallowable projects. There are, of course, many items and subject matter that you can do to your facility, which you will see in both your assessment and you know about, but they may not be eligible under this grant. And so if you ask for them, that's going to take points off your application and put you in a lower position versus others. So while an assessment, as Neil can talk about, and also I'm sure most of you on the call are aware, is all encompassing. It talks about many things about your facility, but not everything on there is going to be an eligible item. So be very careful when you're asking on your application for those items that they are allowable. Again, you want to make sure not to lose points on those. So I'm going to stop here for a moment. I have one more slide, but I want to stop here in case Neil or Warren or Shanika have anything to say about any of these.
So we had one question, Debbie, going back to the bonus.
Sure.
Is there anywhere that an organization can go to find out if they previously received an NSGP award?
So I would say the best way to do it is to contact FEMA, and I'll put in the chat an email to FEMA as to whether they have been a recipient or not. If there's no one at the synagogue themselves that maybe has historical presence there, maybe a president that you can gain certainty from them, certainly you can go in-house, or you can also reach out to Warren or Shanika, and they probably have access to some records, and they will know. But any one of those would be, I would start in-house and then go to Warren or Shanika or their office. And then from there, you can always go to FEMA.
Okay, I'll say something about authorized equipment.
Yeah.
Make sure that when you're getting your quotes and you're pricing up equipment, that you follow the John McCain Act. There are certain Chinese manufactured equipment, cameras and telecommunication gear that you cannot purchase, and it's ineligible. So make sure that when you're getting that sort of estimate or quote from your vendor, that you get that, because we've had some people that have gotten quotes and it's can be thousands of dollars difference in price between the non-UARE or Hasway, or there's like 5 or 6 firms on there, and I think it continues to grow. So Chinese manufactured cameras and telecommunication equipment, just be very careful with that.
And
Thank you, Warren.
one other thought, Debbie, just something I see a lot when I'm reviewing applications, and maybe you and Warren could talk about this, is the project timeline. I see where, can you just kind of go over like what a good project timeline looks like?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. So one of the questions on the application is to give milestone timeline. And it is very important in order to complete that properly and to score highly on that you prepare a realistic expectation of what you see your project's going to look like. And so for all of us, a realistic expectation can be very different. For some of us, that means we get everything done, in a month, and for some of us, not. But for the NSGP, they're looking to see that you understand really what the implementation looks like. So first and foremost, it should always begin with, accepting the grant agreement, because that's your first line is when you get that award, you're going to have to sign a grant agreement, and you can't obviously start any work until then. The second point to that is that the EHP stands for the Environmental and Historic Preservation Form. So before you can start any work, FEMA will require you to get approval. You need to submit that to your state administrative agency. It is a form which will delineate what you're planning on doing, and you need to include all of your projects, whether they include ground disturbance or not. That is really the gist of that form, is for FEMA to make sure that you're not doing anything that's going to negatively impact the ground. But they do require you to complete the form for all projects. So that includes cameras and access control and replacing the doors. Everything that you're asking for must be in that. And you cannot start any projects until you get that approval, which can take up to 90 days to get that approval. So when you're filing your application, you want to make sure that your project timeline includes that. So for example, a project timeline that starts with, meet with a vendor and get my cameras installed starting in September of 2023, which would be right after the awards, is not realistic, because you will not be able to do that. So if you show the grader that you have a realistic expectation, also, there are time delays that happen when you do your projects, and there's a fiscal aspect to it to make sure that you are able to carry the fiscal responsibility of paying for these projects until you get reimbursed. There's also a time delay in terms of weather. Some projects may be weather related. If you're putting in blast-proof film, you can't do that in the wintertime. There may be delays with regard to things that are going on at your organization. That's a busy time, and you don't want to have a time when you don't have a front door. So all of those things should be reflected in a realistic expectation of your project timeline. It's okay to spread it out over the period of performance. You don't get extra marks for concluding it in a year. Whether you end up doing that or not, then that's great. If your timeline is earlier than what you projected on your application, you don't get marked down for that. But for the purposes of the application, make sure it is a realistic expectation, and that you show that you understand that you can't get started until after those things are approved. Warren, is there anything else that I omitted from that?
I'll not admit it, but I'd just like to add a couple of things. On
Right.
the EHPs, there are specific requirements for the photographs that you have to obtain. The HP form is 12 pages long. About 5 of those you actually fill things out in. The rest of it is examples on the photographs. You must have the physical name of the facility, its physical address on every single page or every single photograph. If you put 5 photographs on one page, it's okay just to put it on the page. If you're doing 1 photograph per page, then on the photograph. I always recommend to people just start it in a Word document or Adobe, and put a header and a footer, and then we know that it's there. It's going to automatically carry over just in case something happens. Have to have those photographs. You have to, they'll ask for things like, oh, I haven't put the cameras up. How can I take pictures of the cameras? No, you're going to show where the camera is going to be. So you take a picture of, say, the east wall, and then you'd have take a red dot or a blue square, whatever you want, some type of symbol, put it where the camera is going to be, and then right below it, red dot is camera placement location. I see a lot of them go back for that reason. So it's very critical that you follow those. Ground disturbance, if you're digging a hole, it's perfectly fine. Just let us know that you're digging a hole. Don't tell me you're putting fencing in and you're not digging a hole. I know you have to dig a hole to put a fence in. If you're putting light poles in, just need to know. Know your area, because if you know you're in a historic area, you can probably anticipate that it's going to go, it'll take a little bit longer. It's going to go to a historic review called a Part 106 review. If you know that you're in a Native American tribal area, there's a potential you could be sent out for additional information because of that. I've had a couple come back for that reason. When you fill your application out, you're going to write what you want to do and you're going to have a budget in there. The budget, we can do modifications to the budget that don't change the overall project. So if you said you were going to buy 20 cameras at $1,000 a camera, and now the prices of the cameras have gone up and you can't afford to buy 20, you can only afford to buy 18 cameras. You submit a budget modification through our EM grants portal, that's something we would approve. If you're going to say, you know what, I don't want to do cameras anymore, I want to do a fence. You've changed the scope of the application. That would require you to submit a scope change. Because these are competitive grants and we're awarded on what you said you were going to do, what protection level you're going to provide, it is very unlikely that a scope change would be authorized. It's not impossible, but it's pretty close to that. There has to be some significant reason, very significant reason why. So scope changes, we do the initial approval and they have to go to FEMA for approval as well. So you may have sold me on the scope change, but it has to go up to FEMA and they decide whether they're going to authorize that scope change. So make sure that when you're writing it, you understand that's what you're going to do and you're going to have to do that. Quarterly reports. You're required to submit quarterly reports. Those must be submitted. We're going to now, and we're doing it, when I say now, we're doing it also now, but we're going in the future. If you're not doing your quarterly reports, we're not going to authorize reimbursement. You have to have all your quarterly reports in. There is a possibility that if you've got a current grant and you don't have any quarterly reports in, you may be excluded from applying for the next year's grant because you're not in compliance with this year's current grant. I should be able to look at your timeline and your quarterly report, and I should look at that quarterly report and go, he said that in Q1 he was going to do A, B, and C. He hasn't done it, and why? When you're doing those, when you're building out your milestones, consider also permitting or zoning changes that might have to occur. So build that in, because you may think you can put that 8-foot high fence up, and when you go down for your permit, they say, no, we don't allow fences 8 foot high, it has to be 6 feet high. And then you say, well, I'd like to get a variance on this. That can take an amount of time. So make sure you sort of build that plan review, site review in. You can always do it earlier than you said. It's the later part that becomes problematic. So if you say from January to April, I'm doing site review, permitting, whatnot, you go down to your local zoning office and they say, oh yeah, you can do all this here. And they stamp your permit, you're good to go, you're great. But if not, it can be problematic. And anytime you have any issues, those should be included in the quarterly report so we know where you are. And then when we get that time extension request, because first thing I do when it comes across to me, I go open up and look at the quarterly reports and I say, they said they were doing okay. Looks like everything's fine. Why are they telling me they don't have anything done or weren't able to do it when their quarterly reports represented to me they were on target to get it done? So make sure that you complete those as well. And that's all I have.
Thanks, Warren. You stole my thunder for the next slide, but that's okay because it's a great segue, which I'll get to in a minute. I just want to breeze through this quickly. So what can you do now? As we talked about, if you don't already have an assessment, schedule it ASAP, register with your SAAs. So you need to reach out to Shanika, Warren, to the office there and let them know that you're here and you need to be put on an email list or who you are, and obviously be in touch with Neil and get estimates and start drafting. I cannot say that enough. The more you draft, the more you can look at it, have someone else look at it. You can send it to Neil, he can send it to me. As long as we have enough time, the closer that you get to the actual submission date, it becomes crunch time. And when you look at something, when you're under pressure, you may not catch as much as you do when it's earlier. So please do that early. You can prepare your mission statement. And obviously when the application does come out, you'll be able to finalize. So let me jump up. Did I not put it in? I forgot to put it in. Okay, so I'm actually going to just tell you what I wanted to tell you, and that was what Warren alluded to when he talked about. So in this NSGP, everyone always talks about the competitiveness of the grant itself. And yes, it is competitive, but when you're planning, you should not only be planning about how do I apply, but also understand what it entails when you get the award. And at times, it can be just as difficult and onerous a process as the actual application process. So my 3 bullets were, the first one was timing. And why do I say timing? Because as we talked about, if you have a security need that you need addressed tomorrow, this is not the grant for you to cover that security need. Because first we're going to wait to apply, which is going to come out in a couple of months or a month or so. Then the awards come out, hopefully end of summer, early fall. Then you have to fill out the EHP and all that, and that can take 90 days. So we're looking about probably the beginning of 2024 for the commencement of your first project. So this is not something that you can get done right away. And the second thing is that this is a reimbursement grant. So you really have to prepare yourself and your organization for being able to carry the burden of paying for these projects before. You're not going to get a check for $150,000. This is a reimbursement grant. And as Warren talked about, you need to keep your paperwork up. So you're going to have to fill out budgets and quarterly reports. And so when you're planning now about who's going to be responsible for that, now would be the best time to look at this and say, okay, this is what we're going to have to do. And how should we do that? And who should be responsible? And how can we set ourselves up fiscally to make sure that this is something we can get accomplished, that when we finish our camera project, we can pay the vendor and then get the reimbursement and go on from there. So those were the items that I just wanted to talk about, because the implementation itself can be very time consuming in a sense of making sure that everything gets done so that you do get that reimbursement and keep your projects in line. So that was what I wanted to say. I am going to open up now to any questions that you have and follow up. But again, if you need any assistance, we stand ready to help you in any way that we can. So thank you. And thank you, Warren and Shanika. And I'll open up to Neil to find out if there are any questions.
1 second, Deborah. This is Shanika. I did want to add something. I'm not sure. I did step out for a moment. Not sure if Warren shared this with everyone, but after you are awarded these awards and you purchase your equipment, we are actively monitoring our sub-recipients. And so therefore, at some point of time, we will come out and visit. So when we come out to visit, we want to ensure that the equipment is installed, where we will take pictures and all your financial documentation is aligned as well and together. So I just want to make everyone aware that we are also coming out to ensure that equipment is purchased and the paperwork is in order as well.
Shanika, we asked a question earlier. Does an organization need an active SAM.gov registration in order to be eligible, or just a UEI number?
So if you have a UEI number, that means you have a SAM registration. So therefore, you want to make sure you have a UEI, because as you know, as of April 4th, you cannot apply for federal awards without a UEI number.
Thank you for clarifying.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? It's quiet. That means everyone is either more confused, fell asleep, or knows everything about NSGP that they need to know, and you can all do my next webinar.
No, there's another possible explanation. You did such an amazing job. We don't have any questions.
No, that's out of the question, but thank you anyway.
I have
And it
something
is
else that I could add.
Sure.
Shanika, When you are procuring your vendors, you want to ensure you are following procurement guidelines. When you are procuring your vendor, you just can't select one particular company and just go with them. You have to make sure you are obtaining quotes from these different companies and pick the best selection, not the most expensive, not necessarily the cheapest, but you want to make a selection and be able to support the reason why you selected that vendor. And something else that we learned in a early on presentation as well, a lot of times when you're hiring contracted security, the contracted security, you must have a contract. That you have to have a contract in place to have this contracted security. And something else along the lines with the contracted security, you, before the award is even granted, you can already know who that's going to be. You're supposed to do a solicitation in selecting your vendors and your contracted security. So you want to keep that in mind. And those are some of the things that as we are learning, we are cracking down on. And of course, if we come out and y'all not doing it, we will express it to you, but moving forward, that is something that we want to see.
And the good news is that if you should be so lucky as to receive an award, we do also provide guidance and webinars on the implementation process, how to go through it, what's to be expected, how to complete the forms. And so we are here in that aspect as well, from the application process throughout until the award and implementation process. So, you know, hopefully that doesn't stress you out too much now. I would focus on getting your application done completely and following through that steps. And of course, keeping all of the important remarks here in mind as you're doing that. But rest assured that you're not going to be on your own for the implementation process. We are here to guide you and to help you through that process as well.
Thank you very much, Debbie. And I know just to reiterate what Debbie said, it's a lot of information all at once. So never hesitate to call me or Brian or email. Just reach out at any time. You don't need an appointment or anything like that. If you haven't already scheduled your assessments or updated assessments, technically your security assessments are good for 3 years. I would recommend, 3 years unless you've had other work done or mitigated some of the vulnerabilities that were identified. But in any event, I always advocate, updating your assessments more frequently. So if you're applying and you haven't done that, let us know and we'll come out and do that for you. I put in, Warren mentioned there are a number of equipment manufacturers, mostly from China, that are not allowable under the grant, that you cannot install. I put a document in the chat that you can download that lists those companies. Most vendors, at least that I've dealt with here, are already aware of that, but it's definitely it's good to have and just make sure, just doing your due diligence, it's good to make sure that they have the list and they're aware as well. And then finally, I know Debbie said there's a lot of resources on the Secure Community Network NSGP page. One of those is Debbie's been doing a series of national webinars, and we did, and I think you mentioned in the beginning, Debbie, but a couple of weeks ago, Debbie did a deep dive on filling out the investment justification question by question and what the question means and how to respond to it, best practices. So that recording is on the website. I recommend, if you haven't done it before, or even if you have, it's a good refresher to go through that and watch that recording when you're doing your application. So
we also have one more thing, Neil. We also started a listserv for an email listserv that's on our website to sign up. So I'm sure you will hear the updates from Neil, but we will be updating with any information that we get on the notice of funding opportunity and other updates as we go along. So if you want to subscribe, you can go there and sign up and you'll get email updates as well as any information. But I know you're in good hands with Neil and Brian. So, but just as another resource in case you want to sign up for that. It's strictly NSGP. You're not going to get any other information. So you're not going to be deluged with anything else other than NSGP.
Any other questions?
I did have a question. Sorry, I've got my phone going at the same time as my computer. if we are purchasing something like a fence and we need to tie it to an alarm system, do we need to actually go out and do a multi-party procurement for the alarm vendor? Or can we use our existing alarm vendor?
Are you talking about at time of application or later on?
Well, it's in terms of what Shanika had said about needing to get multiple bidders. If the primary project is a fence around the property, but we want to tie the access control of the fence to our existing access control system, as we go through the process, do we need to build in time to bid to multiple access control vendors, even if we already have one?
No, we don't expect for you to get a new vendor if you already have one.
Okay, thank you.
Because you have an active access control system already. No, we do not expect for you to go out and get a new vendor because you received this grant, no. But for someone who did not have an access control system at all, yes, they need to go out and solicit vendors, more than one vendor.
Any other questions?
I have a question about the IJ, the application that I know you talked about in the webinar, which I saw, but there was a question, I think it was a background question, and I apologize, I don't have it in front of me. It had to do with how do you interact with the community in preparation? Can you talk about that question and how to address it?
So I think there are two questions in it that were, one is symbolic value, and the other one is how your organization would react in the case of how would you benefit the community. So I'm not sure which one you are speaking about, but I'll talk to both of them. So in terms of symbolic value, many communities, many organizations don't really realize the full potential of their symbolic value. Then they respond by saying, well, I have a huge menorah on our front lawn, and so I'm at risk. But every synagogue has a menorah of sorts or something. So you really think of that section as someone who's reading that is completely oblivious to your facility, where it's located, and draw them a picture so that they really understand what you're about. So in other words, what's placing you at risk? Do you have a rabbi that's very outspoken and that is often quoted in the newspaper? Are you close to several other religious institutions, not necessarily Jewish, but others that might make your location a prime target because you can have collateral damage? Are you near a hospital? Are you on a highway or close to a highway where a terrorist might be able to escape quickly or gain access to? So all those things, do you have high profile individuals at your facility that might be targets? Maybe some government employees. Do you have judges or political figures? Do you advertise your programs in the local paper so that people know to come? Do you have all kinds of community programs where you open up your facility to the entire community? So I'm just throwing out these seeds for you to understand about how to completely respond to this, to give that picture, because after all, you're just to like narrow it down to the basics, you're trying to tell the greater, pick me, pick my application. So, as facilities, we're all subject to terrorist attacks, but why should they pick you? And so in your description, you're painting this picture of giving them the full value of why your organization should be considered the subject, a possible target of terrorism. The second question is, how is your facility prepared to respond in the event of a terrorist attack? And the way that I recommend responding to that is to think about what features your facility has that would be exceptionally helpful in the event of a terrorist attack. So do you have a kitchen where you can provide meals to those that are victims? Do you have a generator in the event of a power outage? Do you have support staff, social support staff, psychologists, trauma experts, doctors, nurses? Do you have, those a big gathering room that can, house or sleep many people? Do you have a connection with Red Cross? How those types of things are ways that you can help in the event of a terrorist attack. Do you have training, CPR trainings? Do you have a defibrillator in your building? Do you have you done Stop the Bleed so that your members are familiar with what to do in the event of a bleeding incident? And I could go on, but that's the gist of how you need to respond to that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? I know we're coming up on 2:15, so I want to be cognizant of everybody's time, but I want to make sure all your questions are answered while we're all together.
Soon Warren, Shanika, and I are going to start charging overtime.
All right. Well, it's hearing nothing. It's all quiet. Debbie, thank you. Can't thank you enough. Really appreciate the presentation. Thanks for taking the time to do it. And Warren and Shanika, as always, thank you. Thank you for taking the time today, but for what you all do and your whole team all year round, helping us with the grants and everything else that you do. So thank you very much from all of us.
More than welcome.
Thank you, everyone. It was nice
Thank
seeing
you.
you. Stay safe.
Thank you. And let Brian and I know if you need any help at all, we're here. All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.